African governments are trying to devise a common set of rules to govern the fast-growing market for carbon credits as they channel a large share of revenue towards state coffers. Some have started discussions and actions in this direction, but not all nations on this continent have truly taken up the challenge. Now, Southern and East African nations seem to be in the lead as regards this conversation. Looking at Zimbabwe, it actually took the plunge in May into the $2 billion global industry when it decreed that half of all proceeds from the offset sales would go to the state. Kenya is now seeking to regulate the industry, and Malawi has formed an agency to do the same. Zambia may follow Zimbabwe in the coming days or months, and Kenya and South Africa have had some progresses according to different reports. So joining me this morning from Cape Town, South Africa, I have Craig Morkel, who is the chairman, Gas Economy Leadership Team, South Africa Oil and Gas Alliance, and of course the CEO, iKapa Energy. Thank you so much, Craig, for joining us.
Africa, how are you doing?
Yes, we're good. So what are carbon offsets and how does that differ from carbon credits to start with?
So let's assume that a developed economy has contributed more significantly to global greenhouse gas emissions than developing economies through their industrialization period. They have specific targets declared in their nationally determined commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by a particular date, typically 2050. To achieve that target, they can either decarbonize in their own country or they can decarbonize in another country, and countries on the continent of Africa included. The cost of implementing those projects is either with support of the foreign developed economy, with some participation by people from the developing economies. This then results in a project on the African continent which will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That then earns a credit that could then be transferred to the developed economy as if they have implemented the project in their own country. So a carbon credit is a virtual instrument, a derivative instrument, that accounts for the reduction in one country to be traded with a country that needs to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. We talk about global warming, and global greenhouse gas emissions contribute to global warming. Reducing greenhouse gas emissions in one country then decreases greenhouse gas emissions globally. And this is what the premise of carbon credit trading is all about. Now, the financial instrument called a carbon credit is a tradable instrument, but there is no global trading platform. So when projects in developing economies in particular are financed by investors, including lenders from developed economies, they then include the revenue from carbon credits, not just the sale of electricity and that revenue, or the sale of another energy product and that revenue. They also benefit from the revenue of trading carbon credits. Now, typically, South African projects, as an example, earn such carbon credits, but its shareholders, its investors, have taken those revenues out of the country and traded those carbon credits on platforms elsewhere, thus leaving South Africa and other African countries similar to it out of the sharing in that carbon credit revenues. This, I understand from the summit that was held recently, is now recognized as a source of revenue for African countries, and we should support that. We should support it on the basis that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, in Articles 6 and 9, made provision for developed economies to fund projects that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions in developing economy. They call this mitigation and adaptation. Yet, since that convention framework agreement was signed, there's been little money forthcoming other than simply debt finance. So we need to look at how carbon credits can reduce our debt finance in particular. And so one should consider how these platforms that are being created in country, in African countries in particular, can then trade with their counterparts in developing economies. In the absence at present of a global platform to do so, one will need to do so through some other establishment of a market platform between countries, or leverage an existing stock exchange that may have such an emissions trading system in place already.
All right, so Craig, let me just take you back a bit. We are seeing that there hasn't been much commitment from these so-called world powers or developed countries in terms of the pledges they made. Of course, they're meant to pay about $100 million per year in terms of pledges to be redeemed, and that is meant to ratify the agreement in order to deal with issues of climate change and its attendant effects. But so I'd like to know, why is it that we are saying these kind of reluctance on the part of the developed countries? Why is it that they've made pledges and they're not willing to commit in terms of funds to the pledges that they've made? And what impact do you think it will have on the fight against global warming and, of course, climate change?
No, I cannot speak for any of the developed economies, but one has to go with what they committed to and what they haven't followed through on. Now, certainly, there were commitments made at the time of signing the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that amounted to the equivalent of $100 billion per annum of commitments. This has not been followed through. We cannot understand why, but we can make certain assumptions. The financial strength of many of these developed economies has weakened. They are going through inflation, some call it stagflation. They are having to take care of themselves before they can take care of anyone else. So the challenge has been that to date, the funding that we anticipated would be to honor not simply the commitment made under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, but Article 6 and 9 is based on a fundamentally important premise, an acknowledgement that the global north were historically the major emitters of greenhouse gas emissions during their industrialization, and that their emissions is now having an impact on the global south, developing economies in particular, where they were not responsible for greenhouse gas emissions. And that responsibility, that obligation, is not simply a financial obligation, it's also a moral obligation. And we need to do everything in our power to convince them to honor their agreements, or else we need to accept that there will be no money forthcoming, there will be no debt or inadequate debt, there will not be adequate grant funding, and therefore we need to look at trade, not aid. Carbon credits presents an opportunity to trade, and we should leverage that opportunity now before more projects are developed and contracts are signed with the result that these carbon credits are traded elsewhere in the world and Africa does not enjoy its share of the proceeds. It should. They're using our resources, our natural endowment, our infrastructure, and ultimately end users of these energy products in Africa pay for these products through their tariffs and through taxes, and these profits are then repatriated or sent back to developed economies, whereas we should be using a portion of the savings to the global north in Africa for its own development.
All right, so talking about what Africa can enjoy, according to reports, decarbonization costs require about $9.2 trillion in annual average spending on fiscal assets. That's about $3.5 trillion more than what it used to be. So at what rate can African economies negotiate decarbonization costs? And can a common rate exist across all continents? Is it possible?
It will take an agreement similar to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change at a multilateral level and will require the buy-in of the major developed economies and those from the global south or developing economies. And the best place to do that would be at the next conference of the parties, the next COP, at which time we should have this resolved. And so the meeting that was held in Zimbabwe recently is timely because it seeks to develop a single voice for Africa to take forward the multilateral discussion at a forum that would ideally be linked to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. COP is an ideal opportunity to do that, and as long as we can go there with one voice from Africa, ideally the African Union, we would stand a better chance as a collective of changing the present unfair use of the carbon credits for developing economies only, and really make sure that not only a portion of that comes or stays in Africa, but is then utilized for further development of cleaner energy projects in Africa, and it could be used to subsidize or cross-subsidize some of those projects. At present, we are indebting ourselves in Africa by making loans from the World Bank, IMF, and other multilateral development banks, and then indebting future generations for that. We are getting our people to pay for the energy products through tariffs. Now, why should we therefore not utilize our natural endowments, green energy endowments in particular, and infrastructure to generate more revenue that is in any event being enjoyed by our friends in the global north? I think that's the fundamental question to ask ourselves.
Okay. Now, the World Bank estimated in 2021 that decarbonization costs were $120 per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent in the developed economies and $7 per ton of same in developing economies. Now, this seems to indicate that the main polluters are actually the developed economies. So, from what you've said, that because you've said that multilateral decisions are critical, and that's where the critical decisions can be made, where there are multilateral discussions. Now, are the African leaders, as it were, are they showing the signs that they can be united in determining a framework that helps Africa negotiate for more? Because there have been questions that they need to negotiate for about $113 per ton for this. So are they showing signs that they can be united, they can come together to negotiate more for Africa?
Yes, I think the summit is a good start. I think the summit, as I said, would ideally need to be organized under the auspices of the African Union. We could do it on a regional basis as well, SADC, iKapa, and so on. But the ideal would be to go there as the AU, even as BRICS for that matter, and negotiate the terms of sharing in these carbon credits, the emission trading schemes. What we do need is to have a universal application of this. It would be unfair if one country that is a signatory to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change decides not to participate in this new trading scheme and not to share a portion of the carbon credit revenues with developing economies, including those in Africa. But the summit is a good start, and we should then take it up to the AU level, and then from there to the next COP, and of course, within the United Nations General Assembly itself.
All right, thank you so much, Craig Morkel, for joining our conversation. All right, so we see now that the issue of carbon trading is expected to be a key topic of discussion at the upcoming United Nations Climate Change Conference, which will be held in November in Glasgow, Scotland. Now, leaders from around the world will gather to discuss ways to address climate change and reduce global carbon emissions, and that might also help to fast-track the redemption of pledges made. So this will be a critical and very important platform, as the case may be, for African leaders to unitedly come together and see how they can negotiate a better for credits, looking at the issue of dealing with climate change and its attendant issues. And that will be great and fantastic for Africa, most especially as we know it that it contributes lesser to carbon emissions globally. And that's the end of Business Edge for today. Do not forget that you can visit our social media platforms, as the case may be, at News Central TV, and head on to our websites, www.newscentral.africa, and download our mobile app on App Store and Play Store. Tomorrow is another time where we get to bring you another discussion. My name is Lekan Onabanjo. Do stay with us. The news will come your way at the top of the hour.